Miigwech, Buju, Nindidue Maganidok, Niji Anishinaabe, Nich Madasik, Bungie to go Ninita Anishinaabe, Ningaguji to Indishmayan, a Giganos Indigenous, Nea Shi Unigabing and Donjaba, Nigigandoden, Gwech Biejag Nungum. I'm so grateful to have received this invitation and to be honored to stand before you. I've enjoyed my time working with colleagues here at this school and getting to know students from time to time through the years. And I'm honored with the introductions that were given just a moment ago. I also want to acknowledge this territory, the Haudenosaunee, Anishinaabe, Lenape, and Chinook peoples, and the care that's taken place here through the generations. Today I want to talk about this question of Anishinaabe law and the more than human world. And I want to give you a bit of a context for some of the current cases and activities that you're seeing in the jurisprudence right now that are focusing on the more than human world from an Anishinaabe perspective. So I'll introduce you to these cases and activities, and then I will give you the backstory as to where these things might have come from. As I introduce myself, Nigigandoden. I'm of the Otter clan. That's my family through the generations from Neashiunigaming and Donjaba, which is the Cape Croker Indian Reserve, the Chippewa of the Nawash, about 3 or so hours north of here on the Saugeen or the Bruce Peninsula. And my mom and sister and family live there to this day, and my father lived there for much of his life, although he was born in Yorkshire. And so being able to find that multi-juridical background was something that was in my family itself. I was given the name Giganos when I was young, and so I introduced myself Giganos Indigenous, Nea Shi Winigaming and Donjaba, Nigigandoden. This is the place that I'm speaking from today. Here's my thesis. Indigenous peoples' legal traditions teach that animals and plants are an integral part of our political communities. They are first law professors. They brought us treaties, and we are related to them through clans and dodams, the Otter Dodam. We have often failed to honor our legal inheritance from them, and therefore the work ahead involves revitalizing our legal traditions through restoring our relationships with animals and other life forces on our territories. And here's a picture of the Wasanich areas where I've been teaching in Victoria for a number of years, and seeing that thesis being also revitalized in that space has helped me form some of these ideas as well. So, what is this idea? It is that law is present in the way groups, including animals and plants, law is present in the way that groups solve problems, resolve conflicts, make collective decisions, create safety, maintain or repair relationships, and act on their responsibilities to one another. What I'm saying here is that law is an activity that can be found, of course, in the human world, but can also be learned if we reason in relationship to what the more than human world teaches us about our possibilities in life. That is, if we don't just think about laws as coming from legislatures and parliaments that are interpreted by courts and enforced by executives or police and taught in law schools like this, if we think of that's one way that law comes to us, but law is much broader than those ways. That's an important dimension of law, but it's an under-inclusive way of thinking about law. Law is a human activity and a more than human activity, and it involves standards, principles, processes, criteria, measures, and indicia, benchmarks, precedents, guides, intellectual and cultural resources around regulations, sometimes rules and codes, for making decisions and resolving disputes. So I'm thinking about law as a verb, an activity, something that you do, and as something that we do, the invitation is to learn about how we do this in that broader setting of our more than human relatives as well. So here's one example. Again, this is one of 3 examples about how you see Anishinaabe people taking up this guidance. Here in Article 10 of the Deshkan Zibing Anishinaabe Kichinakanagewen, the Chippewa of the Thames Constitution, you can read that every citizen, member, including the fish, rocks, plants, flyers, crawlers, and 4-legged beings, is equal before and under the laws of the Deshkan Zibing Anishinaabe Akit without discrimination or prejudice. So starting from the idea that our political community, our polity, is more than just Anishinaabe, it's more than just human, it involves all of those beings that precede us and that we're related to because of that evolutionary heritage we are built upon, their priorness. And you can see that every citizen, member of Deshkan Zibing Anishinaabe Akit, possesses inherent rights and title to all waterways defined within historic Anishinaabe migration. So these inherent rights aren't just for the people like us, but it's for these other beings that have these inherent rights to land and water within the spaces that we are living and working and playing on. And if you look at the constitution of the people of this land, you see time and time again a reinforcement of this message that our constituting is in relationship to their presence. In fact, you see this in their Windamag Ewin, which is their consultation protocol. If there are proponents that are coming into the territory that want to do work that could infringe potentially an Aboriginal or a treaty right, the Chippewa of the Thames, the Deshkan Zibing people, have produced law that says here are some of the requirements, here are some of the obligations, here are some of the expectations that we have for our law to be upheld and followed as we work through this consultation and accommodation process. And the first one is this notion that we are all related. Get it away money, which is a basic truth that everything is related to everything else that shares the world with us. And it talks about how we're formed in this way through our clans, and that we are related through those ancestors by treaties with Britain, and I'll talk about that backstory as we go through this lecture, because it was as we entered into these agreements with the Crown, we inscribed our clans on the parchments that were given to us, and in so doing memorialized the earlier treaties that the Anishinaabe have with the more than human world. And by memorializing those treaty relationships on those documents, we renewed and revitalized those treaty relationships with those that came from Britain and other parts of the world. And we expect that consultation, the Deshkan Zibing people say, and discussion will focus on this relatedness. Not just human to human, but the broader relatedness of being a part of this web of life. This, in this instance, the good life, which is placed within a web of spiritual and biophysical relationships to flourish and to be able to enjoy the world together. And this is then taught through 7 grandmother or grandfather principles, 7 gifts. And these gifts here, like Nabuakawin wisdoms, Agidawin love, Chi respect, Akadewin or Zungadewin bravery, Guakwadiziwin honesty, Dabade Nizwin humility, Debwewin truth, all of those legal ethics, if you understood the Anishinaabe, you would see that they're pointing us to the more than human world. For instance, this word Zagidawin, love, we are the Zagin Anishinaabe. Zagin means to flow out. It's like the river mouth as it protrudes into a bay. You're familiar with a couple of these. Mississauga, right, is a place of the flowing out. Well, the Saugeen River at Southampton is one of those places. Saugeen. But you see, Zagidawin. The correlation, the context here, Basil Johnson, one of my elders, taught me about this, is that if we want to learn how to love one another, we should look at what happens at a river mouth. And so all through Grey and what is now Grey and Bruce County, right, precipitation accumulates through the years, through the year, and when it starts to melt or it starts to flow, the water gathers into rivulets. Those rivulets gather into small creeks. The creeks find their way into streams. Eventually those streams join one another into a river. And then that river, with all of that nutrients, all of that energy, all of that life, pours out into Lake Huron in a particularly strong flow. And what happens as a result of the collection of that energy and the directing of that energy is you have the most diverse place that supports the most life in our territory. Because those microbes that are there being delivered from all over give rise to a plant life that's beyond what is usual because of the variety of seeds that get deposited there. And then with that plant life and the density and the diversity of that life, of course, then you get the insects living there in shelter and food. And of course, they become food for the fish that run in and amongst these plants. And with those fish there, then you get the animals coming to feast on them. And then with those microbes and those insects and those fish and those birds and those animals, you finally get the Anishinaabe there. And when we go after a sugar season, we usually spend historically from kind of mid-May till perhaps mid-September in that river mouth area because of all of that diversity of life. What does this have to do with love? Humans are encouraged to gather all of that energy, all of that possibility that falls on us in our lives. That we're encouraged to channel that in ever-increasing flows such that we can become beings like the river mouth that allow for a wide variety and diversity of life to take root and flourish and be sustaining for those that are around us. And so this idea of love is to have that kind of practice of, in a defined way, creating that energy so that others can thrive, others can flourish, others can find that place of possibility. So what I'm saying here is, as we think about this consultation protocol, building on the good life through these 7 kinds of legal ethical principles, we're referring back to the more than human world. Again, in this instance, the river is our professor. We can reason by way of analogy in relationship to its flow to see how we can do our work together, and it's expected that those proposals that come to us, or here the Deishkan and Zibing people, will correlate with that. Now you might say, how can you have law that has a basis of love or wisdom or truth? Isn't this too ambiguous? Isn't this too broad? Isn't this too without form to be able to give meaning to? Well, I've tried to give you one way that meaning can be correlated with all of these practices. They're not just then with linguistics. There'll be stories that are attached to them. There will be teachings that are attached to them. There will be practices that are attached to them. And so they're given more definition through time. We also have to remember what our targets are in Canadian constitutionalism. Peace, order, good government, life, liberty, security, freedom, equality, right? Those are just as potentially ambiguous, just as potentially high in their aspirations, but we choose them for a reason because we think as we draw closer to them, we'll do better by one another. And so it is, despite the vast possibilities that are attached to these ideas of law through time. You work with one another, we work with one another in a constitutional setting in Western forms to try to do better, and so it is in this instance. So there's one example of Anishinaabe people looking to the more than human world to try to figure out their constitutional relationships and then discuss, introduce the implications for others living on the land as they come into relationship with the Deishkan-Ziding people. Next example comes from the White Earth Reservation. This is in northern Minnesota. You can see the map here. Ontario extends through this area, so they're just south of the Lake of the Woods area. The reservation is here. You can see the reservation in greater detail. Well, these Anishinaabe people are obviously related to the Anishinaabe people in Ontario. I taught at the University of Minnesota Law School for 5 years, and when I would travel from Cape Croker to White Earth or Red Lake or Leech Lake or Mille Lacs, I would encounter other Otter people, other people of my clan. We would have mutual obligations to one another because of those clan teachings. It's also the case that the language is similar, and so when I was at the University of Minnesota Law School, after my classes, I would go across the river, and there was 3 Anishinaabe language teachers that I could learn from. The stories were there in rich abundance. And one of the things that these people have done, like the people in this territory for thousands of years, is they have harvested wild rice in all the thousands and thousands of lakes that are in this Minnesota territory. And you can see an example here. Someone pulls the boat behind. Usually these are sort of shallower bodies of water with all of this grass that grows upon it. And as the person pulls through, you can see another person has 2 sticks. And these sticks, you fold one, the grass over into the boat, and then you knock the stick with the other pole, and the rice falls into the canoe. And if you do that 4 or 5 hours, you suddenly have a canoe that's full of these kernels that you can then take back to shore and start to process by breaking them down, stomping on them, firing them, etc. What happens though is that as you're involved with that wild rice harvest, you don't want every kernel, every grain to fall into the boat. You want this to keep falling into the water as well so that the rice itself can continue its cycles. And it's one of these plants that actually depends on human disturbance. You often think about, we need to leave nature alone. Nature will thrive if we're not there. No, there are some plants that do well if we're interacting with them, and this is one of those plants. And it's one of those plants, when it's harvest, forms an incredibly important and rich part of diets, and there's ceremonies around this food, and there's stories around this food that teach us as humans what we might do to live better in the territory, right? Reasoning by way of analogy. In 2000, I think it was 19, the 1855 Treaty Authority promulgated this law. Now in the United States, the Anishinaabe people have treaty rights off of the reservations to hunt and fish and trap for food, social, ceremonial, and commercial purposes. And those rights are recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court. And there's also negotiated agreements with the states of Michigan, Wisconsin, and Minnesota that facilitate that harvest off of the reservations in ways that can correlate with state law. And so here's this 1855 treaty authority, the Anishinaabe authority that's charged with the regulation of the harvesting off the reservation. They say, Minomen, which is our word for wild rice. Min is the word for seed. Minnow means good. Minomen, good seed. Minomen, or wild rice within the White Earth Reservation, possesses inherent rights to exist, flourish, regenerate, and evolve, as well as inherent rights to restoration, recovery, and preservation. So the wild rice itself is given and recognized as having legal personality, given legal personality not by the Anishinaabe, but by the environment that it's found in. And it has a right to pure water and a freshwater habitat, to a healthy climate system, and a natural environment free of human-caused global warming impacts and emissions. The right to be free from patenting. If the certain types of rice gets genetically engineered, then this wild rice suffers in its inhabitants, in its habitations, as well as the rights to be free from infection, infestation, or drift by any means from these genetically engineered organisms, transgenic risk seed, and other seeds that have been developed using methods other than traditional plant breeding. So here's the start of the law, legal personality in relationship to Minomen. And then the provisions of law: unlawful for a business entity or government or any public or private entity to engage in activities to violate or will likely violate the prohibitions and rights in this law, regardless of whether those activities occur within or outside of the White Earth Reservation. Again, of course, the White Earth Reservation has the total control of the land on the reservation, but this 1855 Treaty Authority is recognizing under the agreements they have with the United States that they continued on the responsibility in relationship to this being. And if there's a violation of this, the body would be liable for damages, and part of that damages to Minomen and the habitat is measured by the cost of restoring the Minomen and its habitat to their state before that violation. And then another part of the law says that these rights may be enforced in any appropriate court. So you could enforce that perhaps in a state court or a federal court in the name of Minomen as the real party in interest. So if an action was to be brought, it wouldn't be brought by the 1855 Treaty Authority or the White Earth Reservation or a wild rice harvester exclusively. It would be brought in the name of Minomen, in the name of that being. And so there was a charge, a claim against the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources requesting a declaratory and injunctive relief for Minomen's inherent right to exist within a healthy climate system free from human-caused global warming impacts, the clauses that we looked at a second ago in the past screen. And it was alleged that the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources threatened these rights by taking excessive amounts of surface and groundwater for a pipeline project that would pump 5 billion gallons of public ground and surface water for horizontal drilling under rivers and waterways of the upper Mississippi River. Right? And so the idea is that in the name of Minomen, all of this water going away would threaten its inherent rights to be able to exist within that ecosystem. And so there was a trial in the tribal court. The Ministry of the Natural Resources here appealed this to the federal court, saying, you can't hear this case in tribal court. This has to be something that's dealt in federal court. The federal court was willing to say, no, let's hear to see what the tribal court says. They have first jurisdiction here, and so the federal court deferred to the tribal court, and then the Court of Appeal of the tribal court ruled, and they found that Minomen law could not be enforced beyond the boundary of the tribal reservation. There's no allegation that the DNR officials engaged in allegedly unlawful activities on tribal land, right? Because it hadn't occurred yet, right? The groundwater was going to be pumped at a point in the surface, so there's no allegation that that's happened yet. It's not ripe in terms of the tribal court's law. And then that also drew from federal Indian law, so the law of the state dealing with Indigenous peoples, to find that the tribal court lacked subject matter jurisdiction over this lawsuit. So here the Anishinaabe people are trying to deal with this more than human being, and the tribe's own legal system says, you've overstepped. This is not a ripe dispute yet, and you haven't made out your case for having that jurisdiction off of the reservation. And so this will probably come back to a court at some point when there's ripeness. It'll probably come back on the reservation, and then there'll be further discussions in that tribal court's jurisprudence as to what the implications might be for the off-reservation recognized rights, again, recognized by the states, also recognized by the U.S. Supreme Court. So this is the second example, Anishinaabe of the Deishkan-Zibing around their constitution and consultation protocols. Now we've got this law in relationship to wild rice and what the courts are doing to interact with this. Here's the third example, which is just north of this area. So here is an area called Treaty 3. And Treaty 3, in the background here, you can see Ontario, you can see the kind of bronze-orange area. They've joined a case as interveners that has to do with whether or not youth are more harshly impacted by climate change, and these youth brought an action to say that the change in Ontario's laws that reduced the amount of carbon that would be captured, the youth were arguing that this would have a greater impact on them than older people, and that Ontario's change in law would violate Section 7 of the Charter, life, liberty, and security, and violate Section 15 of the Charter. At trial, the court found that the action on the Ontario government's part was not arbitrary, nor was it overbroad, and therefore there was no 7th section violation. And then the court also found there was no Section 15 violation because these young people facing the implications of climate change, they're not an enumerated or analogous ground. It's not really age, the court says, that would give them, if they could make the point, the standing. It's just a temporality, and the temporality, the court says, is not an enumerated or analogous grounds, and so the plaintiffs here failed at trial. But now, in January, this is appealed to the Court of Appeal, and the Grand Council of the Treaty 3 nation intervened in that case to argue about Anishinaabe law having relevance for Section 15 of the Charter, Section 7 of the Charter, and you can see here arguments that climate change gravely impacts the territory and the ways that those folks then have to live and practice their way of life through that treaty. And the court says, the council says, the court should draw upon Canada's Aboriginal law as well as Anishinaabe law to work out what those relationships will be to see whether or not the Charter has been violated. So these are arguments here in relationship to the more than human world following Anishinaabe law, intervening in a Charter case. And it goes back to what you've learned in the White Earth context or in the Deishkan-Zibing context, which is responsibilities are structured around kinship relationships. The earth is a member of our community or our relation, and we are in a mutual aid relationship with the earth, and so therefore duties of care have to flow through that relationship. So, you've got my thesis. right? Which is the more than human world can provide legal principles and processes. We can reason by way of analogy from them. And then you've seen how these are being implemented in contemporary settings, constitutions, consultation, protocols, laws in relationship to wild rice, and now in relationship to climate change and charter litigation. Where does all this come from? What's the backstory? What are the traditions, legally speaking, that Anishinaabe people are following in trying to make these points? Here's one example of this. There was a time when there were many deer, caribou, moose in these territories. Times when they were more predominant, times when they were scarce. There's this cycle of the hoof nation being more visible and less visible depending on the seasons and depending on the sustenance that surrounds them. Well, the Anishinaabe were noticing this fluctuation, and there came a time when they noticed that there were very few deer, moose, and caribou, and this went on for longer than was expected, and so they started to gather to council to talk about, have you seen any of these beings in our territory? And as they gathered people from across the territory, the answer was, not seen any moose. There doesn't seem to be any deer. And I'm not sure when the last time I've seen a caribou is. So they were reporting nothing was there. And so they deliberated about what they should do, and part of what they needed to do was collect more facts, get more information. And so they went to the east, and they visited the people of the Don, Waban, Aki, the Abenaki, and they heard from the Abenaki people there was no deer, moose, caribou in their territory either. So there's a heightened sense of concern, and so then they go to the south, the Shawnee. Jawan is south. Shawnee, the people that live around the Ohio Valley, a delegation is sent there. Similar types of inquiries are made, and there's no deer, moose, caribou being found in that area. So then the people come back, report their findings, get ready for another delegation, go to Ningabianang. B is the word for water. Ningabi is like where the planet Venus falls into the water. They go to the west, and they talk with the Potawatomi, the Odawa, the Sac, the Fox, the Illinois, the Nikigabo, the Cree, the Dakota, and they come back from the west, and they've got the same message. There's no deer, moose, or caribou in our territory either. And so now there's great concern. Of course, there's another direction to go, and they set off in the north, Gi-Waidanang. Gi-Wai is the word for go home. Anang is the word for star. Gi-Waidanang is the North Star. Right, so they go, Gi-Waidanang, they go to the north, and there they find all of these deer, moose, and caribou, and they see that they're surrounded by crows on Dakwak. And they dare not to approach, because whenever they approach, these birds set off in great noise. And they're worried about their safety, and so they go back and they report what they've seen, and they say the deer, the moose, and the caribou have been taken captive by the Crow Nation. We need to liberate them. And so the Anishinaabe, armed to the teeth, and they go to the north, and they start battling with the Crow. And it's a long and a bitter battle, and there's loss of life, and the worst that humans can do is taking place there, and of course eventually fatigue sets in, and a truce is called. And during that truce, one of the chiefs of the Anishinaabe approaches the chief of the deer and says, "Why are you so unconcerned and sitting there doing nothing when we're risking our very life and limb to liberate you? Why are you so passive? Why are you so unwilling to get involved when our blood is being spilled on the field? And the deer hears the Anishinaabe and says, you are wrong if you think we are here against our will. These ones have treated us better than you ever did when we lived in your territory. And that took the Anishinaabe back, not sure what was meant here, asked for explanation, and the deer says, you have wasted our flesh, and you have despoiled our places of habitation. You've despoiled our haunts. And you've not respected our young ones when they've come into the world, and you've not respected their mothers as they're carrying those young ones. And we left. And the Anishinaabe thinks about what's been said and recognizes that they haven't been using all the parts of the deer, recognizing they've been leaving flesh wasting in the field, recognize that they've not been always doing the controlled burning necessary to clear areas to bring the deer, moose, and caribou into places for pasture, recognizes that those young ones have been taken, recognizes that their mothers have been taken before, feeling convicted by the truth that's being heard from the deer. And so the Anishinaabe says, what can we do? What can we do to make amends? And the chief deer answers back in response, well, respect our territories. Cease despoiling our haunts. Prepare places for us where we can thrive in that setting. And don't waste our flesh. Use all parts of us. And when you take something of us, leave something in return. Could be tobacco, could be something else, recognizing an aspect of reciprocity. And leave our little ones. Let them grow. The Anishinaabe heard the reasonableness of that request, and so the Anishinaabe takes this back to the people, explains, the people feel ashamed, they recognize they're wrong, they enter into this relationship with the deer, the moose, and the caribou, and eventually they come back to the territory. This is often called the Treaty with the Hoof Nation. The notion here is that Anishinaabe peoples have traditions of agreement, have traditions of mutuality in relationship to the more than human world. So when we have need to think about where our laws come from, that can be one of those sources. And when we entered into relationships with the Crown, those principles often found their place in those treaties. This idea of mutuality, linking arms together, making sure that we do so in a heart-to-heart way. This is sometimes known as the covenant chain. You know, this was initially, this boat here is held on by someone with their hand on a rope. That rope can easily fray. The boat can be cast adrift. So you want to make that firmer, so then you turn into an iron chain. But then iron can rust, and that can also disintegrate. So you turn that into a silver chain, but silver can tarnish, and so you need to constantly be getting back with one another and polishing the silver covenant chain, or polishing these relationships of reciprocity. And at the other end of this belt is Anishinaabe a king. It's on the back of a turtle, which references our creation story. So when we made treaties with the Crown, we had these notions of our treaties with the more than human world, but we also had these notions of treaties between one another as Anishinaabe and Indigenous people. So this treaty, The dish with one spoon treaty is between the Haudenosaunee and the Anishinaabe. After 50 years of war, not treating one another well, in fact, treating one another in the worst possible ways that humans can treat one another. What this treaty does is recognize that we need peace. And those peace symbols go in 7 rows. I've talked about the 7 grandmother and grandfather principles already. There's also 7 directions. I've talked about 4 of those directions already. Wabanang, Jawanang, Ningabinang, Giwadanang. There's also Ishpeming, up, Dabashish, below, and Nawai in the center. So peace has to run in all of those directions. There's also 7 stages of life that the Anishinaabe have. The good life, the fast life, the truth life, the doing life, etc. So the treaty has to go across a lifetime, across generations, across different directions, and through those principles. And in the center is this purple object, which represents the land that we live on. It represents our more than human world, our neighbors. And when you're relating to the more than human world, what do you bring? You don't bring anything that's threatening and aggressive. You bring something that's blunt. You don't bring a knife or a fork, you bring a spoon. You bring to our relationship with the more than human world something that's not threatening of one another, so that we can continue to eat out of this bowl, which includes this territory that we're a part of. So Anishinaabe people had treaties with the more than human world. Anishinaabe had treaties with the Haudenosaunee. And then Anishinaabe people and Haudenosaunee people had treaties with the Crown, inviting them into that relationship. I'm going to go here for a second. So when my great-great-grandfather entered into a treaty dealing with 1.5 million acres of land from Goderich to Arthur to Collingwood, north, what did he do? Whoops. He put his little otter symbol on the treaty. Because he's remembering and memorializing that our obligations as otter people flow from those agreements that we have with them. Likewise, there would be bears on that document, and pike, and deer, and eagle, etc. In other words, we said to people from other parts, come and live on these territories in peace, and bring all the good that you have, agriculturally, educationally, in relationship to health, and of course religion was a part of that at the time. Bring all the good that you have and add it to what's already here. And bring that, live in accordance with that, and live in accordance with these principles too. Treaties are sui generis. A morally and politically defensible conception of these rights incorporates both legal perspectives. Treaties are about mutual intentions. Right? This idea of bridging or reconciling or linking these various views, the courts call this intersocietal. And part of the intersocietal is not just with the Anishinaabe as two-leggeds and the Crown as two-leggeds, because remember in the Deishgan Zibing Constitution, the society is also the fish and the deer and the birds and the insects. Intersocietal law would have us look beyond just the human to the more than human world. And there's so many opportunities to learn about this. Here's another expression of this. Treaties in Wisconsin with Washington. Here are all these clans presenting a petition. What do? They join their hearts together. You can see all the lines in that way. You can also see all of their minds, the hearts and their minds are joined. Then the crane, the leader, the spokesperson, sends that message off to Washington in that way. And for the Red Lake people, they're people that organize themselves in this fashion of clan-based governance. And you can see in the clans-based governance, there's all of these symbols in relationship to the 7 grandmother and grandfather teachings as well. There's so much more to say. I'd like to say more about this turtle and this tent, because when these treaties were signed, the first things the Anishinaabe people did is they went and they talked to the turtles. They went into something called the shake tent. They said, should we go and enter into a treaty with the British? We've been at war with them for 7 years. Will we be walking into a trap by entering into by going and seeing them? And the message comes back through this shake tent with the turtles. You can go. There'll be presents. You'll be well. You'll be fine. There was a trader, Alexander Henry, who was amongst the Anishinaabe at this point as this was being decided as to whether or not they would go and enter into these treaties with the crown. And this trader observed this shake tent ceremony. He eventually arrived in Niagara to find that there was 2,000 people gathered from 24 different First Nations over 2 months, where 84 wampum belts were passed to create ideas of peace and friendship and respect. And the work was done in part by reaching out and thinking about what's going to be the implications for the turtle. But as Alexander Henry was traveling, they got to the 30,000 islands around Muskoka, around Parry Sound, and Henry was about to kill a rattlesnake. And he went to get his gun, and the Anishinaabe rebuffed Henry. They stood around the rattlesnake. They all started offering prayers, and they lit their pipes of peace, and they asked forgiveness for what Alexander Henry was doing there, about to kill this rattlesnake. And then this rattlesnake uncoils to 5 feet in length. Right? And the people take this as a symbol to be cautious. What you heard from the turtle is not the whole story. There's other things that you need to be concerned about. Now, this might be an example of, and so it's ridiculous to listen to the more than human world, because this is just humans placing their own interpretations on these animals as to what they would like to hear or do. Right? This is just ambiguity that's rife in this situation. And it is true that human agency is necessary to engage in any form of interpretation. And we need to beware the danger of a single story. We need to understand that nuance is sacred. That is, there's nothing self-reinforcing through this. It's being attentive, using language, using stories, watching, and seeing what the contingencies are as they unfold. The point I'm trying to make here is that perhaps one of the weaknesses of this system is its very ambiguity. Perhaps one of the strengths of this system is its very ambiguity. Because you have to keep talking about what are we thinking about as we go on this journey. It's not just the turtle making a definitive, here's the authority. You just go and make that treaty, all's well and good. You're continually revising, reinterpreting, re-understanding as you gather more information as you go along. And so in this case that led up to the Treaty of Niagara, it's important to recognize that yes, the Anishinaabe people really were trying to take guidance, standards, principles, criteria, authority, measures, signposts, guideposts, and indicia from the more than human world. But this isn't a magical process. This is not a metaphysical process. This is a process that involves humans talking with one another about what they're seeing and then filtering that through their language, their stories, their deliberations. And so we've signed that treaty. Over 250 years have passed. There's 8 species of turtle in Ontario. Most of them are threatened. Rattlesnake. When I was a kid, you'd see them around the Saugeen Peninsula. Hardly ever see them anymore. Right? If our treaties were with the turtles as well as the rattlesnakes, how are they doing in this moment would be one of these questions, which is why the Deeshkan Zibian Constitution puts that out there as the way we should constitute ourselves, which is why the white earth people are saying there's a legal personality, there's a legal agency that we should recognize with monomen, or which is why the people of the Council of Grand Council of Treaty 3 are saying we need to be worrying about the next generation's ability to survive here, and you do that, of course, by paying attention to the science, and of course by creating laws in parliament and legislatures and going to courts. It's good to do that. It's just under-inclusive. Right? Our laws should be broader than those wonderful things that we can learn in a place like this. Our law is not just common law or common law and civil law. It's not just bi-juridical. We live in a multi-juridical nation. And this multi-juridical nation can draw upon these things. Last point, the people from the Yellowstone to Yukon 10 years ago made a treaty with the buffalo. With the buffalo. Renewing old treaties with the buffalo. And this treaties has stories, songs, and bundles that are attached to it. And as a part of that, they worked with the Parks Canada, and buffalo were placed into the backcountry of Banff National Park. And those buffalo are now acting differently when they're there in that space, and the animals around them are. So the magpie has a different behavior when a buffalo is present. And you can go this summer and participate in the 10th anniversary of the renewal of this treaty in relationship to the buffalo, and you can see all of these First Nations across the plains and prairies and Rocky Mountain Slope are doing this. I've talked a lot, but I'm hoping you can see that thesis that I started out with, which is we have so much to learn about the law from the more than human world, and we need to do more to revitalize that. I think I've got about 10 minutes for questions. Thank you for this time.